Good afternoon, everyone, and on behalf of Manulife, we're very proud to be sponsoring the Provincial Leader Speaker Series once again, and it's great to see such a fabulous turnout. With over 3,500 employees locally and 9,000 across Ontario, 35,000 around the world, Manulife is committed to the success of this region and this province. A healthy business environment in Ontario is vital to our success, as both our Canadian head office here in Kitchener-Waterloo, but our global headquarters in Toronto are obviously highly dependent on the success of this province. It's my distinct honour today to introduce the Honourable Rod Phillips, who some of us have had a chance to spend some time with this morning. Minister Phillips was first elected in 2018 as the MPP for Ajax, and this spring was named Minister of Finance. Prior to assuming his role as the Minister of Finance, Minister Phillips was Ontario's Minister of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. In this position, he developed and implemented the government's strategy to ensure the balance of a healthy environment and a healthy economy. Before entering politics, Minister Phillips enjoyed a successful career in business, notably serving as the chair of Post Media. He also served as chair of Affinity Canada, a global artificial intelligence company. He's the former president and CEO of the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation, which reported a then record profit of over $2 billion during his tenure. And he advised us earlier it's the best business to be in. The minister has also served as Chief of Staff in the offices of then Minister of Labour, our own Elizabeth Whitmer, as well as for the former Mayor of Toronto, Mel Lastman. Born in Newmarket, the minister has an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier and an Honours BA in Political Science and English from Western. So please join me in welcoming the Honourable Rod Phillips back to our region.
Thanks very much, Mike, and it was a pleasure. I did get a chance to sit with Mike and a group of business leaders and talk about some of the issues. With Ian's permission, we decided we might mix this up a little bit because in addition to Mike Harris, your member from Kitchener-Conestoga, who's one of our fantastic caucus members, but one of Mike and my colleagues paid us a surprise visit. I was talking to Steve Clark, who's our Minister of Municipal Affairs, when he was driving to a wedding in London today, and I said, well, if you're on the way by, there was a bit of an announcement today from a municipal perspective that a lot of people were interested in. Why don't you drop by? Yes, and stop it. So with everybody's permission, with Ian's permission, if you don't mind, we thought we'd mix it up a little bit. I'll make some comments after, but I thought if it's okay with all of you, we'd have Steve join me up here and answer a few questions. Is that all right? Sure.
Now, Steve, this doesn't mean you're not coming back in December or January to do the second in this two-part series, and Alex Badou's your Chief of Staff, and I've already been orchestrating that.
Alex will make sure I'm here, no worries.
Listen, well, let's get right to it. Why don't you tell us about the announcement today? I was saying to you just at lunch, I was in the news studio at 570 recording next week's show, left the studio and had to be called by Chair Redmond's executive assistant to tell me that she wasn't coming because you had made an announcement. So the newsroom was not very productive today from my perspective, but tell us about your announcement.
Well, I did call Chair Redmond last night. So this morning at 8:30 I attended a fall policy conference for the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and as most of you know, since January we've been reviewing the 8 regional governments, plus the County of Simcoe. Chair Redmond chairs Marco, the mayors and regional chairs of Ontario, and at their last meeting they basically said to me, you need to get on with this. So today we provided a very decisive movement on the regional government file. We want to thank Michael Fenn and Ken Sealing, who obviously you all know Ken, for their work and the 8,500 people who presented it. But we made a very clear announcement this morning that we're going to work with our municipal partners. I announced $143 million in 2 programs to build upon our Audit and Accountability Fund, our Municipal Modernization Fund. We're going to work with them to align our fiscal years together. We're going to move towards a single list of electors, 2 things that municipalities have been asking about for probably 20 years. We're going to pledge to continue to work with them, but we're going to make a very clear announcement that we aren't going to take a top-down approach, so we won't be amalgamating any municipalities in the province, nor will we dictate a council reduction. We're going to work in partnership, and we're going to take that $143 million announcements in those two programs, and we're going to sit at a table with our municipal partners. We're going to drive those savings and those efficiencies that we both know that we can. And if there's one thing I learned on Monday after the federal election, that really people don't care what level of government they're talking about. They just want the three of them to get along and get stuff done. And that's exactly what our government's going to do. So no amalgamations, no major changes, just collaboration. So that's what we announced.
Well, I think everyone's been waiting, certainly around this region and others, of what that announcement is. Now, Rod, maybe draw some connection. There was another announcement that Minister Clark mentioned at lunch that you had made, which is sort of, I guess, connected in one way in terms of that municipal innovation.
Yeah, so one of the things that the Premier had spoken about back in August at the Association of Municipalities conference was providing more clarity. There are challenges we all face at various levels of government, but one of the challenges that the municipal sector faces is timing in terms of awareness about the relationship and the money that we're going to pass along. So he had committed that we would be, there's something called the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund. It's a $500 million transfer to many, many municipalities. And one of the things that had happened in the past was that money often flowed after the municipalities had actually started their fiscal year. Now, the minister had some other things to say about fiscal year, but what we committed to was to roll that out as early as we could. And so those checks went out this week, which gives the municipalities time to understand what monies they're going to get from the provincial government. And this has all kinds of impacts that you might not naturally understand. One of the things that we learned from talking to our municipal partners was because the timing was so late and because municipalities couldn't contract with certainty, things like building infrastructure and roads and other things they had to do all happened at the same time, and they all also happened in the winter, right? So you had this big rush of money into the system at a particular time of year that was actually adding cost in terms of getting the best value, in part because municipalities couldn't be sure it was coming, and in part because of the timing. So on a number of areas under Steve's leadership, we've tried to look at ways, all with a theme of making sure municipal services are well done and that we are getting the best value for taxpayers, but that we do those things. Just let people know what they're going to get in a timely basis. So we made that announcement earlier this week, and mayors by and large were happy to hear about it, and now they can go forward on their municipal budgeting in a sensible, business-like way.
So maybe, Steve, are there other pieces? I mean, we talked at the roundtable today. You weren't there, but Rod and a cross-section of leaders around municipal reform more broadly. I mean, one of the things, and I don't know whether it was, might have been Google or I forget who was mentioning it today, but Ian Klugman. It was the Ian Klugman talking about that we need to see municipal reform and innovation at the municipal level, and how are we going to work together across business and government to make sure that happens, because we're doing a lot of the growth is happening here in the regions and the municipalities.
Yeah, and as part of my announcement this morning, I wanted to reemphasize some of the consultation work that we're being done right now with our municipal partners. We are involved in a pretty major conversation with municipalities and other stakeholders on establishing a new regime for community benefits, on how municipalities build infrastructure and look after those soft services like community centers and libraries. And we've proposed a formula that we've asked for comment. We've got a lot of ideas, and it really is really designed to provide certainty in the system. Certainly we want to maintain the philosophy of growth paying for growth, but we also want that and that openness to move forward. And we think we've got a sweet spot, but what municipalities are telling us is, if you're going to do this, if you're going to change the whole way that development charges work, you got to give us some time to actually consult with you. And we've got some technical tables that we've been working through, and we've been getting a lot of feedback, in addition to all the other things we're consulting on. We're having a major consultation on the provincial policy statement, which really is our planning playbook for the province of Ontario, and we've asked stakeholders to let us know. We're also proposing to transform the way we deal with the building code, and we're involved in a building transformation right now. We've proposed a new administrative authority, which we think will help streamline and provide some certainty and provide some safety and opportunity in the system. So anybody in the business community that wants to be a part of that consultation, it's ontario.ca/building transformation, and we really encourage you to get involved in some of the streamlining efforts that we're doing. The municipal partners have heard me say this over and over again. Obviously I want to build more affordable housing, and I want to work with all three levels of government and everybody in the housing space. But in terms of municipalities, we want to release their burden, give them more time to deliver the great services that they provide in our communities, but at the same time we want them to be a partner. If I'm going to ask my brother and sister ministers and my partners in government to streamline what we do to get housing and commercial and industrial growth happen faster, I want to challenge our municipal partners as well. And they've certainly told me that if I do it in a collaborative way, they're in 100%. So this is a partnership. So if there are things that this group or business community feels that we should be working together on to help streamline, it's a partnership. And it isn't going to be me dictating. It's going to be coming from the bottom up. And I know the chair is very interested in how that bottom up approach is coming with the regions and with our municipalities. And again, it's a consultation.
Well, maybe Rod, I know you have to leave literally to go to an interview in about 2 minutes, but Rod, maybe you can explain why he's the perfect person, what do you say, purpose-built municipal affairs, because he's done both sides of the equation.
So first, just I have to say, there's a great picture.
I say it's typecast.
Yeah, there's a great picture of Steve when he was an elected politician. So he has, as you said, he's right, the typecast municipal affairs minister, has had experience on the elected side and as a CAO and as the head of AMO. Now, the interesting difference between Steve as an elected official was he had a lot more hair, and then which just shows you that the staff are the ones that hit the pressure. But as you can appreciate, and we're lucky across our government, I'm sure Steve and Mike would agree, we have a variety of experiences. And when it comes to the way, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but what not everybody appreciates, that of the $160+ billion that the province spends, 93% of that, so 93 cents of every dollar, is spent by other people. It's spent by municipalities, it's spent by hospitals, it's spent by school boards, it's spent by other transfer partners. So that means that relationships and understanding the nuance of how those levels of government, in the case of municipalities, or important partners, in the case of hospital boards, work, is something that is critical to being able to effectively make the change that we do need to make to make sure the economy and the society is successful. But Steve comes to it with all the requisite skills, and we appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming, Steve. We'll let you get to your next thing.
And I just want to pledge, when I come back to do my speech, you can come and share the stage with me. So, thanks, everybody.
So, Rod...
So I think this was just a really clever way to avoid giving a politician a chance to give a speech.
Well, you had a hand in it by inviting Steve to come down here, but as an old tour guy from his political days, flexibility is one of the hallmarks. So maybe to get started, you had a speech, but why don't you give us kind of some of the highlights you wanted a few points from the speech you wanted to, because we're going to get to a lot of this through the speech, or through the questions.
Sure. So as I mentioned, great to be back. I have some great connections to the community from school, my first jobs. I was a KPMGer in a building down the street, straight out of my MBA at Laurier. Had worked for Glenn Wright at Wright Mogg and Associates before that. So always a pleasure to be back and see some old friends and make some new friends, and really a pleasure to be here at Communitech and get another updated look. I was saying to Ian, the other Ian, that I remember when this was the old tannery that they were thinking about how to tear down. So a lot of great things happening and have been happening over those years that I've had that connection. I'm very proud of it. In terms of what we're focused on and what I'm focused on as the Minister of Finance and our government department is. So much of that is about trying to make sure that we can achieve the vision that we have, and that vision is for, an economy that works well and that fuels the kind of society that we want. We talked this morning about the very necessary link between a growing economy and the kind of services that we want, and we did talk with the roundtable today about the importance of transit and transportation, the importance of skills development, and I know we'll talk more about those, Ian. But all of those require a vibrant economy. All of those require a successful private sector. And this is not a view that every politician seems to share, or at least seems to be willing to invest their political capital in. So, we do have others who have had the belief that they can tax and borrow and spend their way to success, not understanding that all those taxes and every other regulation just makes it harder for the people who are trying through their businesses to succeed and to make us all succeed. One of the things that not everybody appreciates is that our province, as a result of some of those views that we do not share, but our province is the largest sub-sovereign debtor in the world. We owe $360 billion, which is more than any other province or state anywhere in the world. And, the way I often talk about that is two ways. First of all, if we had the absolute best world-class education system from K right through to our university sector, and we have many, many great things about our education sector, but let's face it, when our grade 6 students are continuing, a majority of them, not to be able to pass the standardized exams, that's not a good sign, right? If we had, there was no such thing as hallway healthcare, so if we had the absolute best healthcare system, if we had, all-day two-way go already to Kitchener-Waterloo, and we had
There's one question you don't have to
That's a trigger phrase I've learned here. And if we had an integrated transit network in the GTA that worked effectively, so that when you got to Toronto or people came from there, they would be able to move around effectively. If we had all those things, and we still owed $360 billion, well, then at least we'd have something, right? But we don't have those things. So the challenge that our government inherited, and this is just not by way of excuse, but just to understand where we're at, is we have borrowed more than anyone else in the world. And we have not gotten the public services at the level that we require. When it comes to a competitive business environment, a lot of people will remember, Ian may not be old enough, but I am, I think Ian is, to recall when Ontario was a top 10 jurisdiction when it came to the measure of GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is not a bad way to see the relative wealth. We compare ourselves to a California, which is number 11 today, or a New York, which is number 5. But people are surprised to find out that Ontario today in North America is number 45th in terms of GDP per capita, just ahead of Montana. Right? That's the kind of comparator that I think we need to be real about and look at when we say, okay, what are the things that we need to change if we want to have the kind of competitive economy we need to, both to allow individuals to have the prosperity and the standard of living they deserve, because we as a government believe that that is actually an important role of government, to make sure that we enable people to enjoy their lives, that we enable people to have that standard of living that they have earned and deserved, but also that we are able to afford the kind of services that are so critical. So we've made a number of changes in that direction. I'll get a chance to talk about them in detail, but just at the high level, $26 billion in tax relief for businesses and individuals. That's so far that we put into place. We have made major investments. We have about $90 billion allocated to transit and transportation. A significant announcement last week was alignment, and Minister Mulroney has been working very effectively on this. I understand, Ian, you and your team are meeting with her next week around getting Toronto, that transit transportation crisis there, working, as Minister Clark said, with Mayor Tory, and obviously his council are still having that discussion, but very positive signs about the biggest subway and transit investment in the history of the country happening in the GTA, a critical part of unclogging that central component. Lots of progress. I know about a 35% increase in GO trips here to Kitchener, and that is happening across the GTA. There's been a similar change in Ajax, which is my constituency. Some really important change on the skills side in terms of putting, and we have such great world-class institutions here with Laurier and Waterloo and Conestoga, but over the next number of years, what we've said is we're no longer going to be funding universities and colleges and training based just on enrollment. Today, that is where almost all of the provincial government money, which is for most institutions, most of their money, comes simply from having people in a seat. We are now tying, and after 6 years, we'll be tying 60% of that to outcomes, with a really, really principal outcome being making sure we are producing the kind of job-ready graduates that I know businesses here and across Ontario need. So some very specific actions, but all engineered around that idea of trying to make sure that we can have the kind of successful economy and therefore successful province that recognizes, and this is where I'll stop, that recognizes that we do exist in a competitive global economy. That all of you know that there are jurisdictions near and far that are taking advantage of the assets that they have, that are leveraging the advantages that they have to attract investment, including investment right out of here in Waterloo. And that we have to have the kind of regime, whether it's regulatory or tax or the various other laws that affect things, or the culture that actually encourages this competitiveness, that encourages us to be successful, that actually values wealth creation, that says that's okay, and entrepreneurship, because it is the success in those areas that I get back to that fuels that necessary link between a growing successful economy and our ability to afford the kind of world-class services, be they transit or healthcare we want, and very importantly, be able to support the most vulnerable. So that is the 8-minute version of my 20-minute speech. But that is what we're working on every day. Mike, Steve, trying to make sure that we're making the right moves in terms of creating that environment where we know and have so much confidence in the people of this province, and we know that we'll be successful, but sometimes we just have to make sure that we understand what success looks like, that we understand that it is a competition, and it's a competition that we're in a position to win.
So you've already got the applause line, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to get it again. You are a member for AJAX, so part of the GTA, and gridlock and moving people back and forth is incredibly important. I think the two main themes that I think you heard this morning, talent and transportation or transit, are integrally linked. The Canada's Innovation Corridor Business Council, of which I chair with the Toronto Board of Trade, Canada's Technology, Canada's Connect the Corridor, coalition on all-day two-way go, which many of the businesses around this table, from Google to Manulife, Toyota, are all saying, and along with the municipalities, the number one issue that is holding us back from being successful. So there have been some success and some progress to date. I mean, I guess the thing is, we're going to work with Minister Mulroney, but where does this as a priority for the province from an economic perspective? Because getting investments in the budget and in the planning and in the infrastructure regime is going to be an incredibly important signal for this community and for the businesses that want to invest here.
So, and I was joking earlier that Ian's apparent fixation with trains. I've spoken to Walt, who I know his dad, and apparently the absence of a train set at a young age has caused him to have this. And I should say, and I frankly don't know whether this was a secret or not, but I'll share it. Ian is nothing about his childhood. I have a lot of those secrets too. But Ian actually came to our caucus meeting. We had a caucus meeting here. I think it was our first meeting outside of Queen's Park, was in Waterloo, and Ian came and spoke to our colleagues, to Mike and Steve and my colleagues, and this issue came up. And just so you know, he's as articulate a spokesperson behind closed doors as he is in the open. The priorities that the Chamber's articulated that I've heard today, talent and I'll call it transportation, are clear priorities that we've said we're going to invest in and that we are investing in. So when I talk about Carolyn Mulroney, I talk about, she's a lady with a $90 billion check walking around in terms of the commitments that we've made to investing in transit and transportation over the next decade. And that's out of about $140 billion of expenditures, which of course also have to go into healthcare and education and other areas. Now, how that is done, we are also very fortunate, and I think the progress that we've seen here in KW and elsewhere in terms of optimization of the current transportation network, a lot of that comes out of the great work that we've been able to do with Metrolinx. Phil Verster, who's the new, relatively new CEO there, has brought a really fresh perspective to looking at how we optimize the the existing system. That's why we have 35% more than we had before. And I've certainly heard from municipal partners out my way in Durham that it's a different kind of conversation now in terms of collaboration. There is, of course, then the changes we need to make to really take the next step up, and whether that's getting rid of the level crossings, and making sure that we're able to move effectively and at speed with the current system, or looking at what we need to do with partners like CN, which is a vital partner, and again, a better relationship today as a result of, I think, a more business-like, pragmatic approach by our government and by the agency. So these things are all on the agenda, working their way through the necessary process. When you're going to spend $90 billion of taxpayers' dollars, you also have to make sure it's done the right way. But we understand those two priorities are going to enable that theme I talked about briefly, which is competitiveness, right? That competitive, very livable communities that we want require local transit, and I know there's been progress here on that front as well. And they also provide interconnection in the regional hubs, and we do need to make sure we can fuel the economy and provide opportunity for people by making sure that we have the skilled workforce.
Well, I think you've seen the success. The light rail LRT ION has been a tremendous success by any measure, as far as I can tell. When you look at the trains, they're full, people are gravitating to it, and it's really about the growth of the future. The next phase is the EA's underway. It's coming up soon. I guess it's maybe fair warning that the phase 2 from Fairview Park Mall down to South Kitchener is high on the priority list of this region, because what we've always said as a business community, both the Cambridge Chamber, ourselves, unless this gets built to Cambridge, it won't be fully operational, or won't be fully successful. So those will be the things that we're looking for, because we've put, as a region, a third of the first phase in. We're looking to the province and the federal government to continue to invest in that type of investment here. And I think of other things like Highway 7, where investing here is going to help the province's economy more broadly.
Yeah, so two things. You mentioned the local, the provincial, and the federal role. One of the things, and I think Steve said it, and Premier Ford has said it, he had a very productive conversation with Prime Minister Trudeau. There is a real strong sense of a desire for us to be working collaboratively, and I think what Minister Clark announced today earlier was meant to be a very tangible example of that, and I think people should expect that to continue. Just an interesting point on getting things done. So I was Minister of Environment last time I was here, and one of there's things that government does to make it harder for government, which makes it harder for people, also makes it more expensive for people. So one of the things that I did through a piece of legislation in the spring was eliminated 300 different types of environmental assessments that municipalities were required to do. Now on the surface of that, people say, is that a good thing? How can you get rid of environmental assessments? But what we found was that Ontario was the only province that, for example, required a municipality, if they wanted to build a transit stop, change a snow clearing plan, put in any kind of a bike lane, to have an environmental assessment, right? These are the kinds of things, and we were talking, Mike and I, before about certainty. These are the kinds of things where that was legacy legislation, not done anywhere else in Canada, but that was slowing down the ability for municipalities, provinces, federal government. You can get all the cooperation you want, but if the process takes too long, if it's too cumbersome, things don't get done. Do you know that 1/3 of all of the appeals, called bump-up requests, related to EAs, came from people who didn't live, not just in Ontario, but didn't live in Canada? So a municipality or a piece of infrastructure was being built, but 1/3 of the people that were objecting to those and holding them up many times for years, in one case a decade, didn't even live in the country. Right? Now we may want to make sure, and we do have a very robust environmental assessment process, and nobody in 2019 is going to say that that's not something that we need to make sure we preserve and care for our environment. But we do need to think that if a municipality wants to change its snow clearing plan, they're probably sophisticated enough to do it without an EA. And so these are the things that they kind of are unspoken, but it's sometimes when people looking at government from the outside go, why does it take so long? A lot of that is because of the limitations that we place on ourselves. So we're working very hard to clear those away, in addition to making investments, because making the investments, what we want to do, like in the case of the new subways in Toronto, we want to see them by 2027, 2028. There's a lot of people shaking their heads going, that will never happen. But we know it will never happen if we don't try to, and we know that we need it again, this is what would have been well invested in 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But, you know, as the Chinese proverb says, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. So if we're going to be doing all these things now, we need to move as quickly as we can and as efficiently as we can.
Well, nominally you were down here in advance of your economic update. Your colleagues stole your thunder, so I'm going to get back to the real purpose of today. Last year's fall economic statement, there was a lot of discussion around the U.S. tax rates that had been lowered and the competitiveness pressures that was going to put on Canadian, on Ontario and Canada. This year, I think it's November 6th, you've announced is your economic update. Sometimes they can be big and meaty, and sometimes they can be smaller. Is this more of an update, or is this a mini budget? And what are the types of things you want to get across to the province in presenting your update?
Sure. So one point, before I talk about those details, you know, one of the things that we have committed to and we think very important is transparency. And the purpose of these updates, and they're in fact our quarterly updates. So the government is expected to do 4 updates a year, but the purpose of that is to let those who are interested, presumably some largely people who are taxpayers, know the status of the province's plans. Do you know that 8 of the last 13 updates from the previous government didn't happen or didn't happen on schedule? This didn't happen in some cases. So one of the things we've committed to, and maybe it's from my business background, is that every quarter we will come out and we will report on where we are at. And we will do that regardless of whether things are good or whether things are bad, because we think that that is important to helping restore people's confidence in what's going on. So the November 6th, as you mentioned, Ian, will be the mid-year update, or the fall economic statement. And the focus of that statement is really going to be on talking about the progress that we've been making on the priority areas that we have been talking about. So there's a focus on transportation and the focus that, or the progress we've made there. There's a focus on skills development. There'll be a focus on affordability and the steps we've been taking and new steps that we'll be taking in that regard. There's a focus on smart government. Our colleague Peter Bethenfalvey, who's the president of the Treasury Board, made an announcement this week about his smart government initiative, which is basically saying, you know, of the $160 billion in our budget, about 1/3 of it is spent, as Peter said eloquently, on stuff. You know, so it's on goods and services that ourselves and the broader public sector purchases. Well, this is a great opportunity, obviously, to make sure that we are getting the kind of economies that we can get, and I think that is the sort of thing that people elected us with an expectation that we would deal with. So we'll be talking about that as well, on healthy and safe communities. In terms of the financial progress that we're making, one of the things that we have committed to is balancing the budget by 2023. As I mentioned, we were left with a significant deficit, and that drives significant interest costs. People don't appreciate the impact of that, but if you want the short version of the Ontario budget, about 3/4 of it is tied up in 4 numbers. $64 billion, which is healthcare, $30 billion, which is education, $17 billion, which is social services, and the next biggest number is $13 billion in interest payments. So the 4th biggest line item in the provincial budget is what we owe our creditors. To put that into context, when I was Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, pretty important thing, the environment these days, you would think, we pay more to our creditors in 17 days than we do for all the investments in conservation, environment and parks. In fact, all of the provincial governments put together spend $1.6 billion on the environment. Again, you could not talk about a higher priority in 2019, which is $12 billion roughly less than we pay just in interest. So this is why this matters, right? And it's a working demonstration of how debt crowds out necessary expenditures and why it is so important that we focus on that balance in 2023. I have signaled we were expecting our deficit at the end of this year to be $10.3 billion. I've signaled that we'll be beating that target, but we're going to move in a very prudent fashion to balance, while at the same time making sure that we're able to make investments. We've increased spending in healthcare and education this year. You know, we'll continue on that trajectory as well. But all of this, of course, has to be done in the context of a pretty volatile global economy. I mean, Ontario is doing doing relatively well right now. You just have to look up and see the cranes. And do you know that Ontario has almost 1/4 of all the large construction cranes that are currently operating in North America? 120 of them, or just over a quarter, are right here in Ontario. Right, so we have a lot of good things happening, but we also have to prepare for the fact that there are things outside of Ontario that can affect the economy, and we need to get ourselves on that sound financial footing.
Well, you just answered question 6 here, so I don't have to add. But I think that was important, the important context to understand why the deficit matters, and that's very useful. I wanted to shift gears. We just had a federal election on Monday. There's going to be re-elected, although to a minority government, the federal Liberals. What are going to be the priorities that you take to interprovincial finance ministers' meetings? I guess I'm really thinking around a couple of things. One is competitiveness and innovation in the country, and that's got to be all of the provinces working on that. But in particular, and we said this morning when we were interviewing for the radio, and St. John, Jason Kenney, Premier of Alberta, came and sort of unilaterally said, we're dropping 6 of the 10 interprovincial trade exclusions that Alberta had, and said we have to get to where it's easier to trade in Canada than elsewhere. Maybe talk a little bit about the philosophy of the federal government or the Ontario government around that, because Ontario's got to be a leader on some of these issues if we're going to truly have free trade within Canada, and how that helps all of our economies and the things that we need to invest in.
Yeah, so it is absolutely a priority, Premier Ford. It is actually a fairly quite congenial set of conversations between the premiers, whether it's Premier Moe or Premier Kenney and Premier Legault in Quebec at the premier's table. So I think we are at a time where, despite some of the machinations that, and we'll I guess see what comes out of the federal election, but there's a strong sense of a need for collaboration and to deal with some of these issues. So I think there is a good opportunity there. And as relates to the federal government, we'll see who the new finance minister is. I'm well acquainted with I guess the current with Bill Morneau as well. I think one of the things that I learned about being an elected person, because as Mike mentioned, this was my first time, is you come fresh out of an election, you really do have a sense of what people want. And so I know that they've heard a lot of the same concerns around affordability. I know that they have heard clearly about competitiveness. I also know, and this was actually a friend of mine who is a Liberal and a part of this government, is one thing that minority governments do is keep you very close to what's actually going on, because there will be a need to be responsive. And so we see that all as a net positive. As I said, the conversation with Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford went very well, which I think is, again, either of them would say just what people expect. We'll disagree, and we still disagree on some issues, whether it's carbon tax or others. But in the main, this issues of competitiveness, the nature and the scale of infrastructure required, what we need to do in terms of our health system, giving an aging population, and the challenges of that. These are all things that I think people should expect progress on, and I do think a minority federal government is a great opportunity for Ontario to see those gains.
Almost out of time. I got 2 quick questions, and then I'm going to ask Chris Plunkett from OpenText to come up and thank you on behalf of the group, because I know you're off to do some tours. I think you're going to ClearPath Robotics, another great success story here in the region of Waterloo this afternoon. But you've done a number of interesting things in your life, but one of your previous incarnations was CEO of the OLG. Is the province looking at any changes to gaming and casinos? There's been a lot of interest, I think, Gateway announcing a Western Fair in London, and so and with horse racing and that sort of. Is there any update, or is that something that's not as much of a priority for the government at this point? I'd
say the model from when I was the CEO, which was really around, it was an interesting story, but when I took over as CEO, there were 17,000 employees of the government of Ontario, directly or indirectly, were running gaming, and the idea was, well, that now this is an agency today that earns over $2 billion through the lottery and through the casino businesses. The transformation that's happened has essentially taken that out of the hands of government, not from a legal perspective, but from an operating perspective, to really see a much more vibrant growth. So, for example, in my area in Durham, we have Pickering Casino, which just hosted a job fair, literally hired 2,000 new people. Which in Durham and anywhere is a big deal. Down at Western Fair, the transition to the new facility will expand the nature of the facilities, not just to be gaming, but to be entertainment and hotels and other things. In the case, and I remember it well, of different communities, of course, all of this is only done with the consent of the communities that were interested, and there are many benefits to having a gaming facility in terms of non-tax revenue, tens of millions of dollars, but it was also something that was purely a matter of community consent. So, again, those are choices different communities made. I think we'll continue to see an evolution of that space, but it's a good example of government not doing everything, but still getting what we think is a quality and a safe outcome.
Okay, maybe last question. I wanted, it relates back to the federal election. I think one of the things, some of the messaging that came out is that to me, I don't think there was a coherent message of what the election was actually about, but the voters have spoken, and the result is we have a third of, or half of the Quebec MPs are separatist, or at least, well, that's what they are, separatist party, and you have a federal government that doesn't have any MPs in Alberta or Saskatchewan, and that's not good for the country. And so Ontario's historic role has always been to be that bridge, or to be in some ways the glue that holds the country together. Do you see it that way? And what are the things you, as a senior minister and the premier, will be doing to make sure that we get past, the election campaigning and saying we all have a lot to do and a lot of work to do if we're going to be globally competitive as a country, create jobs, prosperity, and have the social programs that we want?
Yeah, so as I said, I'm really encouraged by the relationships at the provincial level in terms of I think, collaboration, whether it's on things like interprovincial trade barriers or our overall competitiveness, and there are certainly disagreements, but again, those disagreements are talked about frankly and openly, both in private and public, in the way that any of us have to, and I think that understanding there is strong. I have a lot of confidence that you're going to see a government in Ontario that understands its role in terms of the need to be that integrating fabric when occasionally things are a bit choppy. And I was saying to Ian earlier, I had a real privilege earlier in the week. It was the 50th anniversary, is the 50th anniversary of TVO, and Bill Davis, Premier Davis, was the founder, was education minister of TVO. So I had the real privilege of introducing him, and that really, the cool part for me was I got to sit beside him. I mean, this was a guy who was premier from when I was in kindergarten to when I graduated from high school, and so obviously pretty successful politician. But it's so interesting to hear the history and to understand that history of Ontario's role from leaders like him, and I think people should expect that, and perhaps more so. Again, the provinces are going to have to kindle that honest, open dialogue, but do so in the context of a united country, which is obviously much stronger together than it could ever be in its constituent parts.
Well, thank you. That's all the time we have. I know you're tight for it. Maybe I'll get Chris Plunkett to just come up and give thanks. We just hang out here and finish up later.
Thank you, Minister Phillips. Thanks for joining us here today. Thanks for coming back to Waterloo Region and bringing a colleague along. I wouldn't want to say kidnapping, but grabbing out of, I believe he was on his way to a wedding, and you made sure to bring along. OpenText is a global technology company with offices in 35 countries around the world. We're a Canadian company first and foremost. And our roots and headquarters remain in Ontario, where we employ more than 2,000 people, including 1,200 in our global headquarters here in Waterloo. But as a Laurier alumni who's lived here, worked here, you'll understand our success didn't happen in a vacuum. The company developed out of a research project at the University of Waterloo. We benefited not only from the research, but also their progressive IP policy. We've hired and grown from Laurier, Conestoga, and Waterloo, and we've been supported by the Chamber of Commerce and Communitech all along the way. And our future success will benefit from government policies focused on economic fundamentals that you've talked about today. As you mentioned, Ontario is part of a highly competitive global economy, and we definitely see that as we compete around the globe. From our perspective, Waterloo Region is one of the best places in the world to grow a technology company. However, these advantages aren't inevitable. They require attention and investment, and the remarks you made today show that this government understands that and are willing to commit to it. In particular, it was really encouraging to hear about your commitment to investing in transit, two-way all-day go. The applause line, of course, you'll get every time you say that word around town. There you go, that's what I was looking for. And I know your colleague Mike Harris, who's here, has been a huge advocate for that, and we're really grateful. But also skills development, which is really important for growing companies like OpenText, like Manulife, like others that are here today. And also a competitive regulatory and tax environment that you talked about. And we're really interested to hear more about what Minister Bethlen-Falvey announced the other day, and you talked about in the roundtable about smart procurement, smart government initiatives, and how those will roll out. So we're really looking forward to hearing more in the fall economic statement. But we'd really like to just thank you for coming back to Waterloo Region. You're always welcome here. And I'd like to close just by thanking Ian and the Chamber for hosting these events, for allowing OpenText to be part of these events. They're really important, I think, for the region and for all the companies here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.